And welcome to Theology with Coffee. We are your hosts. My name is Kelson Wolverton.
I am Taylor Wood, and this is Casual Conversations about Deep Biblical Truth. All right, so we are still in Revelation 14. Last week, we kind of did a little bit of overlap backtracking just because it had been so long since we had
review.
Yeah, a little bit of review. But this week, we're going to be moving on to some brand new material that we've never discussed before. And this section of Revelation, I mean, this is really fun going through this stuff because this is a little bit more of the obscure stuff, right? This is not the stuff that you books are written on. A lot of people deal with chapters like chapter 14, but there's some really, really good things that are in these chapters. And this chapter in particular, I think, has some very powerful images, some really interesting connections to other books in the Bible. And so it's really rewarding to kind of look at this. It's always important to remember to keep the context, the historical context, and the overall purpose of the book. And so, especially as we move here talking about this last harvest, what are the big picture things that we need to always be keeping our mind on?
Yeah, so remember that this is a time of persecution that's happening with not just Jewish Christians, but Hellenistic Christians all over. And for John, as he is writing, and we actually see that, we talked about it last week, verse 12 of 14, here is a call for the endurance of the saints, those who keep the commandments of the God and their faith in Jesus. And that's the purpose of Revelation, is to have this hope, this endurance to keep on running the race, that no matter how difficult it might be or how hard it is, to keep the faith in Christ. And so this is why John is writing, not to them, but a hope for us as we go through our seasons of life, of difficulty. We're going to keep persevering and knowing that God is in full control. And then as we see here, Jesus is going to win. Like ultimately, he's already won the battle. And we need to have faith in knowing that and his promises with it.
Yeah. As far as where we're at in the overall structure of the book of Revelation is written as a series of sevens within sevens. We have seven letters to seven different churches. And then within this, you have these seven different visions that make up the body of the book of Revelation. Within these seven different visions, we have this section that we're currently in, which is seven symbols. And today we are looking at the seventh of these seven symbols. That means we're finishing off a major section. And when we get to chapter 15 next week, we'll be stepping into a new major section as we deal with the seven bowls, the plagues that come as a result of the end times. But today we're finishing off this major section that dealt with these seven different symbols of end times. And actually, I hesitate to say end times because we've seen a lot of these symbols have a lot more to do with salvation history.
Right.
They deal with sort of a wider snapshot than just a 7-year period at the end of time.
Yeah.
And this one, I think, is no different. But as we're going to see, this one in particular is very much focused on characterizing the end times as this great harvest that's going to take place. And so with that as kind of an introduction, I'll go ahead and read our section for this week.
Great.
And we'll jump in and start discussing it. So we are in Revelation chapter 14, and we are beginning in verse 14. This section we've titled today, The Last Harvest. Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud, one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And another angel came out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, "Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is fully ripe." So he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over fire. And he called out with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, "Put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe." So the angel swung his sickle across the earth and gathered the grape harvest of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia. Now, this fascinating passage gives some really explosive imagery here of what the end times will look like. And I think just to start with a big picture of what this particular vision or what this particular passage here is really focusing on, it's focusing on this time that human history will come to a close.
Yeah.
Like the end is coming. And this end is pictured here as this great harvest. When this occurs, God's will, God's vengeance against evil will be completed.
Right.
God is patient for a time, but the time of patience will come to an end and the time of judgment will occur. Yeah. So this passage in particular really has in mind this great cataclysmic judgment that God is going to bring.
Right. And we kind of see again this like two sides of the same coin. We've been seeing that a lot happening, but the fact of the harvest for salvation and the harvest for judgment. And there's only two categories. You can't be in the middle. You can't be outside of the box. It's one or the other.
Yeah. Here we almost have a parable. Here in the book of Revelation, because we have this picture of the harvest that is sort of being used by John as this picture of what this last judgment will look like. One of the things I find interesting is we kind of have two different harvests that are mashed up and pressed together here.
Right.
We have first a wheat harvest and we have second a grape harvest. And unsurprisingly, we go back to this Old Testament blender that John loves to use. One of the reasons why we're getting these two different harvests, one being a wheat and one being a grape harvest, is the Old Testament prophets will use both of these as images for the judgment day. And so John is intentionally mixing metaphors here. He is mixing these images, but they're all dealing with, in general, this idea of this coming judgment, right? So with that, let's go ahead and jump in and let's take a look at each of these verses and sort of put some meat on these bones, so to speak. Now, right away, we get this interesting image here. And it says, "Then I looked, and behold, a white cloud, and seated on the cloud, one like a son of man, with a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand." So this vision, unlike the previous vision that begins with the angels, this one actually begins with a vision of the Son of Man. What are we to make of this?
Yeah. So, well, it's different just because this person comes on a white cloud, and we've already come with the white cloud that it represents Jesus. And we actually see that even with Daniel chapter 7, which we've mentioned multiple times. Yeah.
In fact, I've got that pulled up real quick. So I'll read Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. This is Daniel speaking. "I continued watching in the night visions, and suddenly one like a son of man was coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was escorted before him." This passage in Daniel, which we've referenced before, this is a clear picture in Daniel, because it's before the time of Christ.
Yes.
It is the coming Messiah and his messianic rule. We now look back on this and we view this as the coming of Jesus Christ, right? And this is a fairly non-controversial position that the Son of Man who comes in the clouds is the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God. Yeah. Any other images here that you wanted to stress?
Yeah. I think the other one, he also has a golden crown on his head. It shows the authority. It shows the elegance as well as who he belongs to, which is God himself, which is King, which is a beautiful picture as well. So not only somebody who comes from the white cloud, like the Son of Man, but also a golden crown on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. And then you got that imagery, not just a sickle, a sharp sickle.
Yeah. Now, once again, this should be fairly non-controversial.
Right.
This use, this clearly has messianic overtones to it with this figure here. But believe it or not, as with everything in Revelation, there's controversy over this. There's some who argue that this Son of Man that's appearing here is not, in fact, the second person of the Trinity, but that this is another angel. It's an angel that's being described as one like a Son of Man here. Just some notes on that. First of all, I did think it was interesting. So some Bible translations, so for example, the New International Version, the NIV, which I know many of our listeners will probably use and be familiar with.
Right.
I believe it actually capitalizes the S and the M in Son of Man, basically indicating for you that they are interpreting this as the Messiah, as the second person of the Trinity, the Godhead, right?
Right.
Interestingly enough, our ESVs here, these editors did not choose to capitalize it. So they're
Right.
keeping that ambiguity in there. Now, you may be wondering if it's so obvious that Son of Man refers to the Messiah, and if it's so clearly an echoing of Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, why on earth is there any controversy around this? And I'd be interested if you have anything to add to this, but the only reason why I can find that anyone has trouble with this being the Son of Man is that right after this, you have someone identified as an angel
Right.
giving a command, and the Son of Man obeying the angel.
Mhm.
And so there are some people that sort of take this and logically say, well, the Son of Man is the one who commands angels, so you wouldn't have Jesus being commanded by angel, therefore this figure is inferior to the second angel, therefore this figure is not the Son of Man. Is that kind of what you found when you were reading on this?
Yeah, that's pretty much like the biggest thing
Mhm.
was that, you know what I mean? Like we see an angel, but yet if this is Jesus, why is that angel telling Jesus what to do?
Yeah.
Right? When it should be the other way around.
Mhm.
Yeah. Mhm.
You also have, oftentimes you have anthropomorphic language being used to describe angels. We actually talked about this last week when we
Right.
talked a little bit about angelology and the fact that usually when angels are described, they are often indistinguishable from humans. They're
Mhm.
often confused for humans
Right.
in the Bible. And so angelic beings often appear to be as sons of men, right? And the phrase Son of Man doesn't have to be a messianic title. The problem is that I have with this is this is very clearly messianic. This is very clearly a quoting of Daniel 7:13, a passage that John is very familiar
Right.
with.
Well, and then you go back, Jesus talks about in Matthew some parables, you know what I mean, about the wheat and the harvest and how he will be the one to do it. You know what I mean? And so even Jesus says, I will be the one who does that. Not just once with the parable, he does it twice
Yeah.
with two different parables in Matthew chapter 13, right?
Matthew 13, 24 through 30. I've actually got that one pulled up. I want to look at that one a little bit later on
Mhm.
specifically.
Yeah.
But another passage that I wanted to point out is the Son of Man was Jesus' favorite title for himself in the Gospels.
Mhm.
And one spot in particular that this is very significant is Matthew chapter 26, verse 64. This is when Jesus is on trial and speaking to Caiaphas. He says, "You have said it," Jesus told him, "but I tell you in the future, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven."
Mhm.
Here, Jesus mixes Psalm 110 and Daniel 7, both of which are messianic Son of God passages, and he mixes these two passages together and applies them to himself. Well, interestingly, John actually does the same. He's almost quoting Jesus directly here,
Yeah.
because John talks about how he is seated on the white cloud.
Mhm.
Well, that seated language doesn't actually come from Daniel 7. That comes from Psalm 110.
Mhm.
So again, John, it pushes, to me, it pushes the realms of possibility that John would accidentally quote two of the most important messianic passages and apply it to an angel, thus creating confusion. And I, for one, and I don't want to speak for you, so please give your opinion, but I do think that this Son of Man figure here is the risen Lord. I think this is the Messiah.
Yeah.
And I don't have an issue with the problem of what's going to happen next with this angel giving this command.
Right.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Mhm.
Yeah. Now let's talk just for a second. I want to zoom out because with this figure being Jesus, something actually very interesting occurs here. You actually, starting in verse 6 of Revelation 14, so it's the section we did last week, you have 7 divine beings in this passage.
Mhm.
You have the 3 angels
Right.
of the first passage. You have the 3 angels at the end of this passage, and at the center you have the Son of God,
Yeah.
who is the Lord of hosts, the commander, the commanding general of the angels.
Mhm.
So you actually have, even within our 7 that's within a 7 within a 7, we actually have another 7 within it,
Yeah.
which is these 7 divine beings, 6 angels, one divine second person of the Trinity, Jesus Christ.
Mhm.
And he is at the center, the position of prominence among these 7 heavenly beings. And again, I think that's just another pointer to this figure being more than a mere angel.
Yeah, that's cool. I didn't
Mhm.
catch that. Mhm.
Yeah, very, very interesting there. So then we get introduced to this angel and another angel. By the way, some people look at this another angel and they say, well, the Son of Man has to be an angel because it says another angel.
Mm-hmm.
The only problem with that is this whole chapter has been talking about angels.
Well, and I think about in Revelation where we talked about where John mentions an angel that has the authority and the voice and the burning stone. I remember we talked about that, and ultimately we came down to that was Jesus.
That's right. So Jesus is described as an angel in the book of the Revelation.
Yes.
Just as he is in the book of Hebrews.
You're right.
It only seems to be kind of modern Western readers that sort of have an issue with this. The angels are like Jesus. Jesus is unlike any of the angels in his supremacy, in his glory, because he is the second person of the Trinity. He is the Son of God. But he is still a part of the divine council along with the angels. And the term angel is a description of a job. It's a job title. It's not an ontological title. It doesn't describe what they are. It describes what they do.
Correct.
If that makes sense. Angels deliver messages.
Yeah.
They deliver proclamations.
Jesus also delivers messages. Yeah.
And this angel is delivering a message. We don't have to view what this angel says necessarily as a command, as if he is ordering, as if the Son of Man is inferior to this angel. We can instead view this as this angel is the herald announcing the purpose of God, but it is the Son of Man, Jesus Christ, who actually executes that.
Correct. Yeah, Michael Heiser would say that. It's just that this angel is pretty much authorizing what God has already established to tell Jesus, the Messiah, to do what he needs to do now.
And again, this is actually quite biblical. Jesus says the Son of Man does not know the day or hour,
That's right?
Nor the angels, only God. And so I think what we have going on here is that God has decreed the time of judgment has come. The last harvest is here.
Yeah.
The angel acts as a herald, but it is the Son who actually initiates with the swinging of the sickle this last judgment, this last harvest, right?
Right.
So this angel, what does he do? He comes out of the temple, calling with a loud voice to him who sat on the cloud, Jesus Christ. Put in your sickle and reap, for the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is fully ripe. So he who sat on the cloud swung his sickle across the earth, and the earth was reaped. So now we get this language of this grain harvest, this wheat harvest that is taking place at this point. And it is the Son of God, it is Jesus Christ, it is the Messiah who is the primary agent accomplishing this harvest at this point. He is the one who swings the sickle, right? What significance do you draw out of that?
I know that we'll go back to the Matthew thing a little bit later because I have some things I want to talk about. But just what we see here is pretty much God is bringing in the elect. You know what I mean? Is bringing in that remnant, coming together to bring back, to what is his after all this time. And then we're going to see a different harvest for a different set of group of people.
Well, let's go ahead and bring it up now.
Okay,
because
great.
When it comes to this parable that Jesus gives in the book of Matthew, I kind of wanted to focus on the last couple verses anyway.
Great.
And so we can go back and do the whole parable and talk about how it relates to this scene here. So this is Jesus. This is in the book of Matthew. Oftentimes Jesus' teachings are grouped together in the series of 5 different sermons that he gives. And this is one of these groupings of sermons that Jesus gives. Not the Sermon on the Mount, but it's still a major dominant sermon.
Yeah.
This sermon in particular is dominated by these parables. One of the parables he shares here in verse 24, he presented another parable to them. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while people were sleeping, his enemy came, sowed weeds among the wheat, and left. When the plants sprouted and produced grain, then the weeds also appeared. The landowner's servants came to him and said, Master, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Then where did the weeds come from? An enemy did this, he told them. So do you want us to go and pull them up? The servants asked him. No, he said. When you pull up the weeds, you might also uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. At harvest time, I'll tell the reaper, gather the weeds first and tie them in bundles to burn them, but collect the wheat in my barn. And just like you, Kelson, I can't read this passage here in Revelation without thinking back to what is probably the original, what John himself was probably thinking back to, which was this statement that this parable that Jesus is telling here in Matthew chapter 13.
Yeah, absolutely. And I went on a research of wheat and tare. And by the way, can I just say, God is incredible. Like, I already know that, but just like learning about his creation and how it all represents. So, okay, a wheat and a tare, they look like the same seed. And in the beginning, it might look okay. But as they grow and mature, they look different.
Mm-hmm. The fruit is different.
The fruit is different, right? Where the wheat would produce fruit, a tare lacks substance. A wheat, as they grow in fruit, a wheat would bow down, where a tare would stand straight. And so, when we grow and mature in humility, we bow down back to the Lord who he is. Mm-hmm. Where a tare says, I can just do whatever I want. I also thought this was great. We can handle all types of pressure, from storms to scorching heat to winds, and through it, they're better for it. Mm-hmm. Which, when we go through trials and stuff, we're better for it, and we're fine. Where a tare, they're completely just easily destroyed. With wheat, you can usually easily eat anything, but with a tare, it's edible, but it actually is poisonous and makes you sick. And so you see these differences that they may look the same on the outside, but as you grow and they grow, they're completely different, even to the point of color, because wheat is gold and a tare has like a purplish hue color. And so we see that this is such a beautiful parable as Jesus is talking, because yes, they're in the same right now, but eventually they're going to be in different categories because they are producing different fruit. Yeah. They have different attitudes. They have different lifestyles. And Jesus is going to bring the wheat into his barn, where the wheat is going to have judgment. Yeah.
Well, I want to return to Matthew 13 at the end, because I want to talk about those last couple verses there and how they kind of get drawn into, I think, this larger context.
Yes.
Another passage of scripture that John undoubtedly is sort of thinking about. Again, the idea of a wheat harvest, it's used frequently in the prophets to talk about this day of judgment that God is going to bring. So John didn't make this up. Jesus didn't pull this out of nowhere, but there are other passages that deal with this. One of the prime examples of this is Jeremiah 51:33. Right. This passage says, "For this is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says. Daughter Babylon is like a threshing floor at the time it is trampled. In just a little while, her harvest time will come." Again, there's multiple passages that talk about the harvest, the grain harvest, and compare that to the day of the Lord, when judgment is going to be brought against wickedness in the earth. This one stood out to me in particular because it's talking about the judgment of Babylon. And the passage right before this one, right, John is talking about the judgment of Babylon. And again, John doesn't do things by accident. John just doesn't stumble on these things. He has a purpose and a reason for doing this. And I do think that there's a reason why he puts this passage about harvesting right next to his passage about fallen is the whore of Babylon, because he is tying this back to these Old Testament prophecies that talk about the judgment of Babylon and tie that to the day of the Lord. And remember what we talked about last week, where the judgment of these nations is not just a judgment of an ethnic group or a government system or a geographical territory. The judgment of the nations is the judgment of the dark gods, the dark forces that run those nations. And so the judgment of Babylon here in Jeremiah chapter 51:33 talks about the fall of the system that sets itself up in opposition to God. Yeah. And every evil empire will be described as Babylon in biblical literature, because every evil empire has the god of Babylon behind it, including this great final Babylon that John is going to talk about in this book. Yeah. But again, I just thought, how neat is that here we have this passage comparing the destruction of Babylon to this wheat harvest. And right here we have the destruction of Babylon followed by describing the judgment day as this last great wheat harvest.
Yeah. Absolutely. And then I forgot, but I love the tie in with the Feast of Booths, which is a festival that would happen in October, or it's considered the Feast of Tabernacle, or another term, the Day of the Ingathering. And that was the celebration of the harvest, the celebration of what God has done, where God's people, this is one of the pilgrimages that everybody had to come to Jerusalem. It didn't matter where you were at. They all had to come. You did the sacrifices. You did the things. And it's also to experience God's Shekinah glory. And not only that, through the climax of the sermon that you would be at, they would actually get palm leaves and sing Hosanna, Hosanna in the highest.
Mhm.
And so we see that even in this Feast of Booths, there is a remnant, you know what I mean, getting excited for what God has already done in the past for the harvest, but what he's going to do in the future.
Yeah.
And that he is this Messiah, this King who will come rescue.
And this idea of the whole earth gathering at Jerusalem. At Zion,
yeah,
that's going to play into this next image, the image of the grape harvest.
Yeah.
By the time we get to the end of it.
But I thought that was cool how the Feast of Tabernacles kind of, because we've mentioned Rosh Hashanah,
Mm-hmm.
and then, you know what I mean, how Feast of Booths come into play with that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, before we move on to verse 17 and this sort of second side of the coin of the last judgment here, just wanted you to take note of this statement here that the angel makes. It says, "For the hour to reap has come." And I want you to note that if you have your journals or your Bibles, underline that, star that, put a box around that. That's significant. That phrasing there, the hour, this is tied to Day of the Lord language that we see in the Old Testament in books like Hosea, in books like Amos, and books like Joel. In fact, you would not go amiss to go back and listen to a couple of the episodes that we do on Day of the Lord, because we deal with those minor prophets, and in particular we deal with these with Obadiah was the fourth one that we did. All four of those books, they have a time theme of the Day of the Lord, this hour of the Lord's judgment. So take note of that, because John is now tying this passage, this harvest, in with those other passages, many of which, including one I'm going to be quoting in a little bit, Joel chapter 3, are tied in directly, are quoted almost directly by John in this passage. So this is a Day of the Lord passage. This hour of reaping is an image of the Day of the Lord. The Day of the Lord, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, I think, when we get to the end. But two of the things that we see with the Day of the Lord is a day of salvation, and it's a day of judgment. Okay? Think about that. Think about that, especially with that parable that Kelson talked about with the wheat and the tares. What is a terrible day of calamity for one group of people is a day of glory and rescue for another group of people. All of that is tied into this day, this hour of reaping, this Day of the Lord, right?
Right.
Anything else you want to say about these verses before I move on to 17?
I just thought this would be a fun note. I didn't catch this. The word sickle is also said 7 times in this paragraph.
Oh, how interesting. So we have another 7 within a 7.
7 within a 7, which I just thought was really intriguing.
Yeah.
And then I thought this is interesting. The word sharp, it's said at least 3 times in this passage. And then when it talks about Jesus and his 2-edged sword, which altogether would represent 7, all in Revelation, which I think is really cool, because it's tying in not just sharp as this 2-edged sword of his mouth and what he's about to do, but also even here with the sickle of with the harvest. So another 7. We're just seeing 7, 7, 7, 7.
Yeah. So this vision, it's interesting, because this vision of the harvest, it's sort of divided into these 2 pieces, these 2 parts. And John actually switches the metaphor here. He switches the parable. At first, it's a grain harvest, but here it's now going to become a grape harvest as he gets into verse 17. And I think the reason why he's doing that is to tie the crushing of the grapes with a very violent image that he's going to be giving at the end of this chapter. But it starts out with another angel. Then another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. And another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has the authority over fire, and he called with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, "Put in your sickle and gather the clusters from the vine of the earth, for its grapes are ripe." So the angel swung his sickle across the earth and gathered the grape harvest of the earth and threw it into the great winepress of the wrath of God. Okay, this is just pregnant with this beautiful, strong, powerful, violent imagery. Now talking about the judgment and likening it to gathering up grapes, throwing in a wine press, and crushing, destroying the grapes in this moment. And one question I had, and none of the commentaries that I was reading really satisfied this question, is, And you made a couple comments in our episode so far that kind of have got me thinking, wondering what you're thinking as far as this goes. But the wheat harvest side of it clearly has a good and a bad.
Yeah.
Right? The wheat harvest side of things, and as we saw in that parable, the harvest is rescue for some, but it is judgment and destruction for others.
Right.
The grape harvest, though, it in particular, with the trotting of the grapes and the wrath of God, I don't see a good side to that, right?
Yeah.
So is there a bit of a fork here in these two images?
Yeah.
These images are similar, they overlap, but while the grain harvest may include the rescue and salvation that comes to those who belong to Jesus Christ, the grape harvest that he is talking about seems singularly focused upon the punishment of the wicked. Is that kind of the way you're reading this passage?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, some images that came into my brain was, yes, you have the Passover and you have unleavened bread, but you have the fruit of the vine and how all those come into play. And with the unleavened bread / fruit of the vine, those are together. That was another pilgrimage that everyone had to come to Jerusalem. And this in particular was because of to be able to cleanse yourself, which we can't do, but like to be able to be in the presence inside the temple. And here, I just think this imagery is interesting, is the fact that this angel comes out of the temple, and then we have this other angel from the altar who has authority. Which do you? I have some questions about this angel.
Okay,
so
let's not get to that angel
yet. But I just wanted to throw that out.
Yeah.
There. But we have these grapes, and then I also thought maybe this is not it at all. But I went back to Numbers and how Israel is at the edge of the promised land, and they're seeing, right, these grapes that are large and bountiful, and yet what's the problem there is the giants. And they have, right, and the 12 spies go out, and that's their problem, is they don't have faith that God can take that down, so much so that, right, they're in the wilderness for 40 years. And so even with this grape, it may look plentiful and exciting and juicy. In the end, it only just satisfies just a little bit of an appetite.
Yeah.
And I felt like, I don't know if John's going back to that, but I just thought about Numbers, about here they are about to be able to enter, but yet they allowed their own pride and selfishness and lack of faith that they never got to experience the fullness of who God is at the promised land.
Yeah. The vineyards, grapes, wine, these have a double-edged sort of metaphorical meaning in Scripture.
Yeah.
As you rightly pointed out, the large clusters of grapes are used to demonstrate how enormous God's blessing is upon the promised land when the Israelites get there.
Yeah.
But that is paired with the terrifying large giants who are in the land.
Yeah.
Wine is, and this is not just in biblical literature, this is actually in the ancient world in general.
Right.
Wine was always viewed as sort of the marks of a prosperous nation, as a nation that has plenty of wine. But wine is also a sign of judgment. Wine is, and those who become drunk on wine.
Yeah.
In particular, Revelation uses the image of the cup of God's wrath, becoming drunk on God's wrath. We've already seen that language being used in the previous image with the whore of Babylon, she who is drunk on the cup of God's wrath. And so wine and grapes, off the top of my head, they often fulfill this very, in the book of Revelation in particular, they have this imagery of punishment, of judgment.
Yeah.
Certainly here, we're getting this idea of crushing, of destroying.
Right.
This is not a good image of the crushing of the grapes here in this particular case.
Yeah, because with the wine press, pretty much it's grapes that are they have to, I think that's a word, be trampled and stamped on by your feet into a trough, into a duct that would lead into a lower trough that would be a basin where the juice was collected.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there couldn't be any like with a grape, you have the skin and all that stuff. Like none of that couldn't be there. It had to be completely juiced to the point there's like nothing that you could tell that it's a grape any longer.
Yeah. In the background of this is sort of this old Jewish idea that at the judgment day, those who were saved by God, the chosen of God, they would eat this great feast at the end of this final harvest of God. We get this language in, for example, the Damascus document, which is a ancient. It's roughly this being written at the same time as the New Testament. It's this apocalyptic document that's talking about how God is going to judge the earth. It's written from a Jewish perspective, not necessarily a Christian perspective, but it's interesting how many similar languages and images you get there. The reason why is both the writer of the Damascus document and John are working with the same Old Testament material.
Yeah.
And again, the Damascus document talks about this great end times feast where the elect will eat this feast over the battlefield in which all of the rebels of God have been slain. That's kind of a gruesome image there. Well, what do you have at feast? You have wine.
Yeah.
And it's interesting here that you have the crushing of evil, the crushing of wickedness is necessary to produce the wine of this feast in God's presence. You also get this language in the previous image that we looked at last week, where you talk about the smoke of their torment going up forever and ever. They have no rest day or night, these worshipers of the beast. But those who are rescued, the elect, they rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. And so I do think behind this, you're getting this Jewish idea of part of the rescue of the earth, part of what's necessary, part of what must happen is that evil must be utterly crushed. And only when evil is crushed can the elect of God feast and enjoy the presence of God.
Yeah.
And again, they would sort of take this abstract idea, and the image that they would use to describe this is this image of a feast after a great battle, right? Eating your feast in the battlefield in which the enemies are slain.
Yeah. Well, it kind of even reminds me of like going back to the beginning of what creation was in general, when there was no evil, when there was no sin, there was no darkness. It was like walking in the presence of God, and everything was in perfect harmony.
Yeah.
And here we are. It has to be completely destroyed in order to have that complete harmony once again.
There could also be a little bit of a supernatural element of this, just in the fact that in ancient warfare, when you conquered an enemy, one of the things you would do is you would raid their camp, you would take their supplies, you would take all of their king's stuff, and you would lay it out as a great banquet for your king. And if their king were still alive, he would sit there and watch as the king who defeated him ate his booty, ate his bounty, right? Ate the things that were taken from this fallen, this defeated king. Well, this starts sounding a lot like Ephesians chapter 2, Ephesians chapter 3, where Jesus disarms and removes the powers of these dark spiritual forces, and he gifts to his people the bounty that he has taken from these rebels, right? And so I think I don't think John is necessarily quoting Ephesians specifically, but I think both Paul and John have the same image of the conquering king removing the territories and the bounty and the wealth of these rebellious angelic forces and gifting that to the elect, to those who belong to the kingdom, right? And all of this is sort of taking place at this final harvest here. Okay, so we have these two characters. We have two more angels here to complete our group of 7 divine beings. And we have the angel who bears the sharp sickle, and we also have the angel who has authority over fire. What a strange statement
and
that
from
is.
From the altar, not from the temple.
Yes, and then you have one of these angels, just like the previous one, coming out of the temple, whereas this other angel, who does appear to have some sort of a role of supremacy, he comes from the altar. And given his tie with fire and things like this, I would assume this is the altar of incense, and so it's the inward most intimate altar, not the one that sits outside the temple, but the one that sits within the temple. Right. So what do we make of these two characters, and how do they stand out, these angelic figures here?
So I've read a lot. Pretty much everyone seems to be conclusion about the one about the altar, the angel from the altar, and that be the same angel who is with when we talked about Revelation chapter 6 about the different symbols and stuff, how the martyrs are crying out and asking for vengeance.
Yeah.
And this would be that angel who was incorporated with those people who were martyred for their faith.
So this angel tied with fire would be also sort of a patron angel, a protector, an avenging angel whose particular job is to watch over martyrs and perhaps avenge what the world and what the demonic forces have done to those who are elected, chosen. Is that sort of the trajectory that you're following?
Yes. That's what I got or followed from Revelation 6, 9 through 11, when it talks about that.
There are some who have tried to name this angel.
Right.
Peroel is a name. I am guessing this is related. Probably this is L is a Hebrew part of speech, obviously, but pur is tied to the Latin word pyre, which is obviously tied to fire. And this Peroel is considered a archangel who has this sort of authority over fire. Again, this is something that the other people are looking at this passage and sort of tracking some things down. I don't know that I would teach that as necessarily scriptural, but it's interesting to think about.
Which, I guess my thing was, I did read about that, but where do we get that name specifically?
This would be from, I'm guessing, medieval tradition.
This would be medieval tradition. Okay. Because, you hear other, we have Michael, I've heard Raphael, all these other ones, but I've never heard that one in particular. And so I was curious where that came from, if that was from one of those interbiblical Testament books, like Enoch, and it was something else, or if this was just tradition that was passed down. Because I'm with you, I wouldn't necessarily say it's this specific angel. All I know is that I can see where commentators have said about the angel being that same person that helps, protects, and guards the martyrs in Revelation chapter 6.
Yeah. And it's really hard to say. I do not believe this is an Enochic character.
Right.
This character does not have nearly the history behind it as, say, a Gabriel or a Michael, both of whom are mentioned not only in Enoch, but in scriptures as well.
Yeah.
Or as a Sariel or as a Raphael.
Yeah.
These are, again, angelic beings that are mentioned in Jewish texts that are quite ancient. This particular figure, again, I'm guessing here, I'm speculating, it probably comes from much later than those. This angel, it's interesting that he is tied to fire. Now, what was a common held ancient Jewish belief is that part of the element that God used to create angels was fire. There's a psalm that actually talks about how the flames are God's angels, God's servants. And so there is this tradition of angelic beings being tied on an ontological level with fire, God using fire to create them, fire and wind. Fire is also tied, obviously, to God's judgment in multiple different places. Peter, in particular, talks about how God judged the earth once by water and a second time by fire.
Yeah.
And so whatever we say about this particular angel, he seems to have a very important role that is with bringing the fire, bringing the wrath and the fire of the Lord. And this, to me, kind of to circle back to that first image of the grain harvest here, I think we start to see why it is that the Son of Man plays an important role in the first harvest, but here he takes on a more passive background role. So in the first harvest, this grain harvest, I don't mean first in terms of I'm not separating these, saying these are two different harvests, sequentially. I just mean first in the first image that John gives.
Right.
Okay. In this first image of the grain harvest, the Son of Man plays this central role. He plays this role of, he is the one who bears the sharp sickle and he is the one who reaps. In the second one, this is now this angel who has authority over fire, which we believe this means that this angel is in particular this angel tied with the avenging wrath of God, and another unnamed angel who bears the sickle. Okay, if what we're thinking is correct, and if these two different images, the first image of the harvest of the grain does include with it the harvesting of faithful believers as well. That's all part of it.
Mm-hmm.
But the second one is really focused on the wrath of God and the destruction of the enemies of God's people and of God's kingdom itself.
Yeah.
Does that explain why the Son of Man is taking a special interest in his role as of saving the elect? And so that's where his role is coming in. He is the one rescuing and saving the elect. But here, when it comes to the gathering up the grapes, when it comes to gathering up the wicked, this is now a job that is being delegated to these powerful angels. Does that maybe explain why the Son of Man appears in the grain harvest, but not the grape harvest?
Yeah, no, I could see that. Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's not that he's not involved in the second one.
No.
But it's that he is given a special role when it comes to salvation and rescue and protecting the elect.
Yeah.
His special role seems to be that of a saving role in this particular harvest. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Once again, John is not pulling this out of nowhere. There are several passages in the Old Testament that deal with this grape harvest as an image for the end times. Perhaps the clearest echo that we get is Joel 3:13.
Right.
This one says, "Swing the sickle because the harvest is ripe. Come and trample the grapes because the winepress is full. The wine vats overflow because the wickedness of the nations is extreme." And this is just one verse out of a larger Day of the Lord context here in the book of Joel. And notice how in particular in Joel, once again, the focus here is on the judgment of the wicked nations, right? Those who are not a part of God's family, they are the ones who are destroyed in the winepress. Yeah. Yeah. Anything else you want to comment about that?
No, you're about to do the other one I was thinking about. Yes.
Well, do you want to read this one?
No, you go for it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So another passage of scripture that deals with this harvest, and this one in particular is going to tie us into the last couple verses here.
Yeah.
This is Isaiah chapter 63, verses 1-6. "Who is this coming from Edom in crimson-stained garments from Bozrah? This one who is splendid in his apparel, striding in his formidable might. It is I proclaiming vindication, powerful to save. Why are your clothes red and your garments like one who treads a winepress? I trampled the winepress alone, and no one from the nations was with me. I trampled them in my anger and ground them underfoot in my fury. Their blood spattered my garments, and all my clothes were stained. For I planned the day of vengeance, and the year of my redemption came. I looked, but there was no one to help, and I was amazed that no one assisted. So my arm accomplished victory for me, and my wrath assisted me. I crushed nations in my anger. I made them drunk with my wrath and poured out their blood on the ground." So again, a very macabre scene here, which is tying the idea of treading the grapes in the winepress, the grape juice that gets all of your clothes, and tying that with bloodshed that happens as a result of warfare.
Yeah.
And again, the fact that the Son of Man is not mentioned here by John in relation to the grape treading doesn't mean he's there, because Isaiah 63, this is clearly a messianic passage, right? And so the Son of God is still at the forefront of judging the enemies. It's just that John emphasizes the special role he plays in saving the elect by mentioning him as the one with the sickle in the previous little section there that we dealt with. But yeah, that's pretty amazing. That's a wild passage.
That is wild, and I thought this is really cool. Is we see when you see the throne room and the lamb and the lion, and how there's wounds, right? Even the clothing of his own blood from dying on the cross. Now we see the garments that is not of his blood, but of the blood of the judgment. Yeah, which. Turnaround.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Major turnaround.
Major turnaround. Yeah.
Absolutely. So John's take on this in verse 20, "And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and the blood flowed from the winepress as high as a horse's bridle for 1,600 stadia." Now, 1,600 stadia, this would work out to about 200 miles.
That's right.
And so you can imagine a 200-mile diameter circle around the city of Jerusalem, with the blood from all of the death and destruction being 6 feet tall, 6 feet deep.
I'm like 5'4".
That's how violent this is.
It's crazy violent, yeah.
Now, it's not demanded that we necessarily take this literal, right? This is
Right.
not saying that this is something that is literally going to take place, but it is a shocking image that shows the completeness of the wrath of God at this last harvest. Something else that I think is kind of significant to take note of with this is we talked about this festival aspect, this feast aspect of this, right?
Right.
And so you've talked about how these festivals of the ingathering, these harvest festivals that were tied to the Jewish, obviously economic calendar with the harvest, but also this religious calendar. And these festivals were times where everyone was to gather in Jerusalem.
Yes.
Well, here we have a gathering of everyone around Jerusalem,
Yeah.
right? It's very reminiscent of language that we're going to get later on, where there's going to be this great battle. And spoiler alert, I do not believe that this great battle takes place at Megiddo. Okay, I think that is a poor translation. I think the final battle of Armageddon takes place at Jerusalem, and that we're getting a picture of what the result of this battle will be.
Yeah.
Where all of God's enemies are destroyed at Jerusalem, and God's new kingdom is established on this very fresh battlefield now of all of the slain enemies of the Lord. And this includes both human and divine rebels that are destroyed at this place.
I thought it was interesting. I think it's Josephus who said when the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, there was so much blood that happened that day that it actually quenched the fires in that area. And so I just thought that was an interesting image. You know, the fact it's the same thing. It's very vivid where you're just going to see it for miles and miles and miles and miles. And then going back to the number, right? 1600. There was some biblical saints that mentioned some things that I thought was really interesting. I don't know if that's true or not. I thought the concept of it was really interesting. So for example, 4, we have the 4 corners of the earth so that means like from all areas, like there is no escape. Then from 4 times 4, we have the 4 living creatures as well as the 4 wheels. And then times 4 is another times this 100, which would equal 1600. Prometheus would say that. Then we have also, what's his name? Alexander of Caesarea, who said 10 times 100 would mean complete magnitude of evil. Okay. And then that 600 would be the engagements of sin through the nuisance of creation. So Jesus, or God rested on the 7th day, took 6 days. So with the 6, as well as in the 600 year, that's when Noah would build the ark and the flood would happen. So we get the 600 times 100, which would also equal 1600.
Yeah.
Thought those were really interesting. Not really for sure if that is the number specifically, but I thought the ties of those things with Revelation was very intriguing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, we don't read this and think that John is doing anything by accident.
No, right.
He has intention behind this.
Yes.
And these numbers are meant to make us think.
Yeah.
They're not numbers just for the sake of throwing out numbers.
Right.
They're numbers that are intended for us to sort of think, well, what does this mean? What's behind this particular number?
Yeah.
So I think that's a very good observation there. As we look at this, passages like this, just like we talked about this vision of hell and those who are burning for all eternity from the vision last week. These images can make us as contemporary Christians somewhat uncomfortable when we think about these battlefields soaked in blood and this violent imagery here. But this is where I would remind you and encourage you, if you haven't, go back and listen to our Day of the Lord episodes. Because one of the things that is consistently tied with Judgment Day, the day of the Lord, the moment where God's wrath is poured out, the moment when human history as we understand it comes to a close, it is completed and a new era of perfection begins. Yeah. One of the themes that arises from this, the great and terrible day of the Lord, right? It is this idea that this harvest is terrible and it is horrifying and it is violent and it is gruesome and it is stomach churning for those who do not belong to the kingdom.
Yeah.
But for those who do belong to the kingdom, it is a necessary and even a good purging of evil and wickedness from God's good creation. I want to return us to Jesus' parable of the wheat and the weeds. And once again, I want you to notice what Jesus says at the end of this parable. When he's sort of giving the meaning, he says, let both grow together until the harvest. At harvest time, I'll tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and then tie them in bundles to burn them, but collect the wheat in my barn. They are gathered at the same harvest.
Yeah.
Those who belong to the kingdom and those who are rebels. What is destruction for one group becomes salvation and rescue for the other group. It's the same event, but it yields two very different results.
Yep.
Right? And so all of these passages really end with this invitation, this question, which group are you in?
Yeah.
Do you belong to the elect? Do you belong to the group that will be rescued, that will be saved, that will be glorified, that will be transferred into the permanent kingdom of the Son? Or do you belong to the group that is going to be destroyed in hellfire, that will experience the full wrath of God?
Yeah.
It also gives an explanation for why even today we experience so much evil and brokenness in this world. It is not that God is ignoring evil. It is that God is patient.
Yes.
He is waiting for the right time for the full harvest to happen.
Right.
And for you Christians who, by the way, I'm going into our applications.
I I was tracking.
for you Christians, and I count myself among this group, by the way, who get frustrated when the wicked and the evil and the schemers seem to win so much and not get their just deserts, who get frustrated and ask God, why is it that the wicked are able to prosper to such a degree? We can take comfort of the fact that all evil will be dealt with.
Right.
God is waiting. God is patient. And why is he patient? Because he desires that none shall be lost, but all receive the gospel and be saved.
Yeah.
God's patience means salvation.
Yeah.
So each day that we wake up and we have not experienced the last harvest means it's another day when a sinner can come to know Jesus Christ, when a sinner can be rescued. Another day that we get to drive back spiritual darkness.
Yeah.
We are promised victory in the scriptures.
Right. Already.
And ultimately, this passage about this harvest, this is a passage of victory.
Right.
It is a promise that the harvest will happen and that we will be victorious. So we do not run in fear, but we look with hope and we work with hope, knowing that this great harvest is coming and we have a job to do until it comes.
Amen. Yeah. I think you said it perfectly well.
So do you have anything you want to add to that? Any applications? Or
No, I think it's completely true. And like I said, God is waiting and he is being patient because he wants all people. And we talked about that, all people, no matter what language or color you are, you know what I mean? Where you've been from, how good you are to how bad you are, you know what I mean? If people come to repent and to confess that Jesus is Lord, that's one more person who gets to be a part of this family of God, to be part of this harvest, because he doesn't want that for everybody, because I think some would probably say, well, that's really harsh. No, that's not harsh. God's been waiting. And remember, we say God is loving, but remember, God is also just too.
Yeah.
Because he's a holy God and he cannot be, and he's set apart. He cannot be himself in sin, in that. And there is wrath for those who decide to do whatever, you know what I mean? To not make God be their king, but people being their own king and all that stuff. And so he's waiting for all people. And so even to the one that I know growing up, I always had people like, I just wish we were at the end times already. You know what I mean? Which I get that. That means being closer to the Lord. But I think there should also be cautious the fact, hey, there's more people who still need Jesus. Yeah. And not just that, but isn't that our call as believers, as family of God, for us to share the greatest message with the people in our lives, from family to strangers to work friends, so that they don't have to become part of the great harvest, but become the wheat harvest.
I always felt that way before a big exam in school. I'm like, Jesus, it'd be great if you go ahead and come back now. Like I would love that, right before finals.
Uh-huh.
It's like, this would be a good time for you to come back.
Just right now.
Or I remember thinking that when I graduated and had to start paying off my student loans, I'm like, Jesus, now would be a good time. You can just come on back.
Right.
I'm having to make these loan payments now. Something else you said there that also got me thinking about just some other things. I mentioned that Damascus document earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And again, there are a lot of similarities between apocalyptic Jewish literature like the Damascus document and what we're reading in Revelation. Mm-hmm. There is one very significant difference, though. In the Damascus document, it is Jews only who are saved. Mm. And they are saved because of their ethnicity, because of their race, because of their Jewishness. Yeah. It reminds me, not to cross over too much, but it reminds me about some of the things I've been emphasizing in my study of Romans right now, where the gospel, which was first to the Jew and then to the Gentile, it had been corrupted from first to the Jew to the Jew only. Yeah. And this is the way that these Jewish apocalyptic writers viewed this. They saw it as when Jesus comes back, or not Jesus, when the Messiah arrives and when God judges the earth, the Jew only will be saved. Yeah. And all these filthy Gentiles will be judged for all of their filthiness, which was a corruption of the mission mandate given to the nation of Israel. Right, yeah. The nation of Israel was intended to bring the nations into a relationship with God. Yeah. Well, what do we see in Revelation? Revelation, it is not the Jew only who is saved. Right. Instead, it is those who are washed by the blood of the Lamb. Yeah. Those are they who are rescued by Jesus Christ. It is those who have put their faith and have a enduring faith. Yes. Right? Those who have believing loyalty in Jesus Christ, they are the ones who experience this rescue and glorification at the second coming. Yeah, no, absolutely. Because when you were discussing that, I was going back to, I taught Jonah to my youth kids. And that was what Jonah was supposed to do, was supposed to be that missionary figure to go to Assyria, who's never even heard of the gospel. But he was so upset because why did they deserve grace and love and abundant and slow to anger from the Lord after everything they caused to them? And so for him, he was upset because he said, no, that's for us as Jews, for who you've given us, not for the Assyrian, not for the Babylonian, whatever empire that is, but it's just for us. Yeah. When they were called to be the ones to share, not just for the Jew, but for all Gentile, for all of us around the world. Yeah. Yeah. Well, in the book of Amos is calling out the Jews because they're sitting there saying, oh, we wish the day of the Lord would come. Yes. He's like, are you crazy? Are you crazy? Don't you realize that what you're wishing for, because it is for God to judge you? Yeah. Because you are not saved just because you are Jewish. Yes. You must have a relationship with God. Then you will be rescued on that day of wrath, that day of the Lord. It's not just by being Jewish or just by keeping the customs. It is by having a relationship with the Eternal Father. So, all right, good. Well, I think that's a good place for us to leave it off here. We start our next big section here with the 7 bowls of wrath coming up in chapter 15. And now we're going to be reaching back into Exodus. So we're going to be getting a lot of plague language coming up. So that'll be fun. Anything you want to say before signing out for today? Nope. Just keep reading it. If you haven't done it already, we encourage you to read it in one setting, one time, all the way through. Maybe go back to some of those past episodes. I know that I've had to go back a few, just on our own, for things, study it, allow the Spirit to reveal, listen to it, you know what I mean? Do it all so that you would be familiar. Yeah.